The Donner Party, the dream, the challenge, the horror. The truth about what was next in the real West.
In a past that is now lost forever, there was a time when the land was sacred and the ancient ones were as one with it. A time when only the children of the Great Spirit were here to light their fires in these places with no boundaries. When the forests were as thick as the fur of the winter bear. When a warrior could walk from horizon to horizon on the backs of the buffalo. When the deserts were in bloom and the streams pure as freshly fallen snow. In that time when there were only simple ways, I saw with my heart the conflicts to come. And whether it was to be for good or bad, what was certain was that there would be change.
Over 400,000 Americans made the overland journey to the West by wagon train in the mid-19th century. For nearly all these pioneers, it was a journey brimming with excitement, challenge, joy, and sorrow. But for one group, it was a journey into the deepest, most unexplored recesses of the human soul. That group was the Donner Party.
It's a story that tests Western tradition and culture. It is perhaps the kind of experience that took people not only to the edge of their humanity, but beyond their humanity.
Part of the fascination with the Donner Party is studying them to find out just what we are and who we are, and how ordinary people behave when pushed to the limits of human endurance.
The story, despite some of the more lurid details of cannibalism, should be an inspiration to all of us. The kind of courage and perseverance and stoicism and sense of adventure and optimism that Americans had.
The overland trek westward was a carefully timed event. It began in spring, as soon as the grass on the plains could support the pioneers' oxen, horses, and mules. The immigrants tried to complete the journey to California or Oregon in 6 or 7 months. For if a wagon train took too long, the pioneers could be trapped by snows for the winter in the western mountains. The Donner Party took too long.
James Reed was one of the organizers of the original Donner Party in Springfield, Illinois. He was a carriage maker and a contractor and very prosperous, a wealthy man.
With his wife Margaret and 4 children, Reed loaded a grandly conceived 2-story tall Pioneer Palace car as well as 2 other wagons, and left Springfield for California on April 14, 1846. Traveling with the Reed family were their hired help and the families and servants of the Donner brothers, George and Jacob. In all, the group now numbered 31.
My father, with tears in his eyes, tried to smile as one friend after another grasped his hand in a last farewell. Mama was overcome with grief. At last we were all in the wagons. The drivers cracked their whips, the oxen moved slowly forward, and the long journey had begun. Virginia Reed, 12 years old during the Donner Party's ordeal.
They headed out across the Great Plains along the Platte River Road, the trunk highway that would carry the vast majority of pioneers west.
We are now on the Platte, 200 miles from Fort Laramie. Our journey so far has been pleasant, the roads have been good, and food plentiful. Indeed, if I do not experience something far worse than I have yet done, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started. Tamsen Donner, June 16, 1846.
Antelope and buffalo steaks were the main article in our bill of fare for weeks, and no tonic was needed to give zest for the food. Our appetites were a marvel. Virginia Reed.
In the 1850s, tens of thousands of pioneers headed westward on overland trails annually. But in 1846, the year of the Donner Party and one of the early years of the westward migration, only 500 wagons passed the landmark of Independence Rock on the way to California and Oregon. Beyond Fort Laramie came the Rockies and the rugged lands of the West. Here, the Platte River Road gave way to other routes. One, at least, was untested.
Fort Laramie was a major turning point on the trail. There they encountered leaflets that were being distributed by a man named Lansford Hastings that said he'd found a new and shorter route to California. The people in the Donner Party talked about the Hastings Cutoff, as it was called, and some of them decided to break off and go and meet Hastings at Fort Bridger. This was a crucial turning point in their lives, although they certainly weren't aware of it.
Fort Bridger was in fact a frontier store owned and operated by mountain man Jim Bridger. The Reeds, the Donners, and others arrived there expecting to join Hastings, but he was gone.
Hastings left earlier with another party, and he simply left instructions for people to follow him on the way west.
Old Jim Bridger, who stood to benefit from traffic along the new route, encouraged them to follow Hastings. The group now numbered near the 87 men, women, and children who would be known to history as the Donner Party. James Reed was the obvious choice as captain, but perhaps because of his arrogant nature, the group elected 60-year-old farmer George Donner to that post. They set off alone into the uncharted western mountains.
You have to understand that Donner, Reed, and the others were not experienced travelers. They weren't mountain men. They had no Western guide experience. They were simply farmers or craftsmen. None of them had ever known the desert. None of them had ever seen truly high mountains. None of them had ever known a world of thirst.
They had to cross the rugged Wasatch Range in eastern Utah. At the dead end of the rough road from Fort Bridger, the Donner Party found a note from Hastings. It vaguely outlined a route over the mountains.
There was absolutely no road, not even a trail. The canyon wound around among the hills. Heavy underbrush had to be cut away and used for making a roadbed. Virginia Reed.
The Donner Party spent more than 4 weeks in the Wasatch Mountains blazing a trail for their wagons. And in fact, at one point, it took them 6 days to only go 8 miles. This was a critical delay, and it meant that they reached the Sierra more than a month behind schedule.
Emerging from the Wasatch Mountains through Immigrant Canyon, the Donner Party saw that Lansford Hastings' route now led them around the Great Salt Lake and across its brutal salt flats.
When they came to the Salt Lake, they found a grassy area in which to refurbish, as they say, recruit their cattle, and then prepare for the trip across the desert.
Here they also found another correspondence from Lansford Hastings.
He left a note saying that they should bring with them enough water and food for a 2-day crossing or 2-night crossing. He thought it would be maybe about 40 miles. Actually, it was about 75 miles to the first water.
We see the Great Salt Lake area as being a flat basin. We see it as something easy to cross. What we don't realize is that under much of that salt area is water. And if you tried to dig a couple of feet, you would essentially find yourself going through mud and slush.
James Reed's heavy Pioneer Palace car sunk to the hubs of its wheels in the briny mud. In the oppressive heat of late summer, they crawled forward while many of the party's other wagons made it safely across the salt desert. Alone, after 3 days and 3 nights, their situation was desperate.
We had only a few drops of water left. Another night there meant death. We must set out on foot and try to reach some of the wagons. Can I ever forget that night in the desert when we walked mile after mile in darkness, every step seeming to be the very last we could take? Virginia Reed.
The Reeds reached Jacob Donner's wagon and safety, but they had to abandon 2 of their own wagons, including their Pioneer Palace car. They were not the only losers. Other party members also abandoned wagons, and a quarter of the group's livestock, including nearly all of Reed's cattle and oxen, had run off, crazed with thirst.
All traces of them were lost. A week was spent here on the edge of the desert in a fruitless search. Almost every man in the company turned out hunting in all directions. Virginia Reed.
The Reeds, the most prosperous of the Donner Party members, were now the poorest. The month was September, and more unforgiving country lay ahead. After surviving the disastrous Hastings cutoff through Utah's salt desert, the Donner Party found snow falling on the surrounding mountains. They still had over 400 hard miles of desert and mountains to cross, and food was already running short.
The party realized that it would be impossible to go across the Sierras without being resupplied. And they decided to send 2 men ahead of the party, Charles Stanton and Big Bill McCutcheon.
McCutcheon, a huge man, was married and left a wife and child behind. Stanton, small in stature, was a bachelor. Some of the party wondered if a man without family ties would return.
They got to the Humboldt River, which is where they would have gotten in the first place if they had taken the Fort Hall route through Idaho. They met the main trail there.
By the time the Donner Party reached the Humboldt River, the men were certainly nearly exhausted, and tempers were very short and tended to flare. At one point, climbing up a steep grade, a wagon driven by a John Snyder attempted to pass Reed's wagon, and James Reed exchanged words with John Snyder, and it resulted in both men lunging at each other. James Reed pulled out a knife and plunged it into John Snyder's chest. Snyder staggered a few steps and died.
A German immigrant, Louis Keseberg, demanded that Reed be lynched on the spot.
My father was no coward, and he bared his neck, saying, "Come on, gentlemen." But no one moved. Virginia Reed.
Instead, the party banished James Reed, sending him into the desert alone while his family was allowed to stay with the group. He would survive and cross the Sierras into California before the winter snows. As the Donner Party moved along the sluggish Humboldt River, the only route across Nevada, they faced a new problem: Indians.
These were relatively primitive Indians in terms of their technical culture. They weren't armed with guns, and they had very simple bows and arrows, but they were masterful thieves.
If they couldn't run off the livestock from the party, the Indians would shoot an arrow or two into the animals, thus wounding and crippling them, and forcing the party to abandon those animals.
By the time the Donner Party reached the end of the Humboldt, they had lost over 100 head of livestock.
The Humboldt River is one of the unusual rivers of America. It's a river that rises in the mountains and runs dry. In fact, it's a river that evaporates and eventually ends in a swamp or a sink of alkali.
The Humboldt had saved its hardest test for last, a salty, dry hellhole known as the Humboldt Sink.
From the Humboldt Sink to the Truckee River was 40 miles of terrible desert, just as bad as the desert in Utah. More wagons were abandoned. Everybody had to walk. They had to relieve the burden on the oxen.
They reached the base of the Sierra Nevadas desperate and nearly out of food and water. Here, they were cheered with provisions delivered by one of the bravest of their members, little William Stanton, the bachelor.
He came back from Sutter's Fort with 6 mules and 2 Indians and met the party in Nevada. He had no family, and there was no mandate that he return, but he did.
Stanton led the party to the shady cottonwoods and refreshing waters of Truckee Meadows, where they rested for several days and prepared for their assault on Truckee Pass, less than 50 miles away. On November 3rd, they assembled at Truckee Lake, just a few miles below the pass. Snow had fallen, and it looked like more was coming.
When we reached the lake, we lost our road, and owing to the depth of the snow on the mountains, were compelled to abandon our wagons. There was much confusion as to what articles should be taken and what abandoned. One wanted a box of tobacco carried along, another a bale of calico, and some one thing and some another. Louis Keseberg.
Despair drove many nearly frantic. Another start was made, men and women walking in snow up to their waists, carrying their children in their arms and trying to drive their cattle. Virginia Reed.
Stanton broke trail to the top of the pass, saw a storm approaching from the west, and hurried back for the others. He found them settling for the night around campfires. They ignored his urgings to push for the pass.
Some of our party were so tired and exhausted with the day's labor that they declared they could not take another step. So the few who knew the danger the night might bring yielded to the many, and we camped within 3 miles of the summit. That night came the dreaded snow. Virginia Reed.
The winter of 1846-47 is probably the worst winter on record in California history. The first storm that hit the Donners snowed day and night for 2 weeks. And when that first storm let up, the snow was 10 to 12 feet deep on the ground.
Truckee Pass, the route that after the winter of 46-47 would be known as Donner Pass, was sealed. With the massive early November storms, a relentless winter had begun. The trapped members of the Donner Party were about to experience a season far longer, colder, and more horror-filled than any of them could dare imagine.
The mountain men had a saying about the high country in the far west. They said there's 3 seasons here, or 3 months: July, August, and winter.
We returned to the lake and prepared, as best we could, for the winter. Louis Keseberg.
At Truckee Lake, they hurriedly fashioned crude structures out of logs and hides. Patrick Breen, an Irish immigrant, settled into a cabin with his wife Margaret and their 7 children. He began to keep a diary.
It's an absolutely remarkable document. He had to make the entries with numbed fingers in this cold cabin. It's the only account of the months of entrapment as the events occurred.
November 20, 1846. We now have killed most part of our cattle, having to stay here until next spring and live on poor beef without bread or salt. Patrick Breen.
They accepted their fate with true Irish fatalism. They knew they were snowbound for the winter. They stored the meat, and they ate the hides first. Now, this was amazing. Other families ate the meat first, and the hides last.
Margaret Reed was poor and husbandless now. She and her children moved in with the Breen family.
They took in the 5 Reeds, who certainly would have perished if they hadn't been extended this Irish hospitality. This was an old tradition in Ireland. Traditionally, you just don't turn away a beggar or a stranger at the door. It's very bad luck.
The Breens would cook a bone, take all the meat off of it, and then it would go to the Reeds, and they would boil the bone over and over again to get whatever they could get out of it.
While the Breens were the best prepared for the winter's trials, the Donners were the least prepared. George and Jacob Donner and their extended families had not even reached the lake that would soon bear their name. Instead, they camped about 6 miles away on Alder Creek. They set up lean-tos covered with old quilts and buffalo robes.
December 13, 1846. Stanton and Graves and several others making preparations to cross the mountains on snowshoes. Snow 8 feet deep on the level. Patrick Breen.
Some felt that the best chance for the entire party lay in a group of the strongest reaching civilization. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. And on December 15th, they started up towards Truckee Pass, some leaving behind wives or children. The little bachelor Stanton and the 2 Indians from Sutter's Fort, Luis and Salvador, led the way.
They figured it would take about a week to get to the nearest settlement, Johnson's ranch in the Sacramento Valley. It actually took them 30 days.
This party encountered blizzard after blizzard, unbelievable suffering and hardship. They came upon the 2 Indians, Luis and Salvador, near death, and crazed William Foster shot both of them to hurry them along.
The purpose of their death, or their use after their death, was cannibalism. The party was trapped in the snows, exhausted and hungry, and at this point they turned on the Indians and ate human flesh.
By the time the Forlorn Hope reached Johnson's ranch, 8 of their 15 members, including Stanton, had died. Stanton's body was the only one not cannibalized.
The survivors attempted to package and label the body parts as belonging to a particular person, so anybody related to that particular person wouldn't be eating the flesh of their relative.
William Eddy was one of only 2 men out of 10 in the forlorn hope to survive. Mary Graves was representative of the 5 women in the group who all reached Johnson's ranch safely. This pattern would be repeated with the rest of the Donner Party, where the men would be twice as likely to die as the women.
In the American West, the hero is a rough and tough surviving male. The Donner Party, the survivors were the women.
Women have more fatty tissue than the men. That's the kind of body that you want when things are very cold. And that certainly was a factor in the survival of the women. I think another factor was that the men had to do the hardest physical work. And I suspect that the men didn't get any more food than the women.
Back at the lake and on Alder Creek, the snows deepened. Nearly 60 members of the Donner Party were still entrapped. They waited desperately for rescue parties prompted by the success of the Forlorn Hope, ignorant that that group of snowshoers had taken a month instead of a week to escape their mountain prison.
December 25, 1846. Offered our prayers to God this Christmas morning. The prospect is appalling, but hope in God. Amen. Patrick Breen.
Mrs. Reed had been saving some items for a special Christmas dinner for her and her children. She had a bit of tripe, she had some bacon, she had some beans and some dried apples. She put these into a stew.
When we sat down to our Christmas dinner, Mother said, "Children, eat slowly. For this one day, you can have all you wish." So bitter was the misery relieved by that one bright day that I have never since sat down to a Christmas dinner without my thoughts going back to Donner Lake. Virginia Reed.
February 5, 1847. We have but a little meat left and only part of 3 hides. Has to support Mrs. Reed. She has nothing left but 1 hide, and it is on Grave Shanty. Milt is living there and likely will keep that hide. Eddie's child died last night. Patrick Breen.
The snow got so deep that they were trapped inside and had difficulty getting wood. Each of the structures eventually became filled with the refuse of everyday life. The stench, day after day, week after week, of excrement and urine and food.
Amid the filth and despair, Patrick Breen found order.
Every morning and every evening, Patrick read what was called the 30 Days Prayer. This was a long prayer to the Blessed Virgin with all sorts of big Latinate words that I'm sure those 14 people in the cabin didn't understand, but they were magic. They gave them hope.
We had to kill Little Cash the dog and eat him. We ate his entrails and feet and hide and everything about him. We lived on Little Cash a week. Virginia Reed.
8-year-old Patty Reed found comfort in the 4-inch doll given to her by her recently deceased grandmother. She could only wonder about her missing father.
James Reed went ahead after he was banished from the party along the Humboldt River, crossed the Sierra into California. And his idea, of course, was to immediately organize a rescue party to carry provisions back to the struggling party in Nevada.
Reed's first rescue attempt in October was defeated by soft snow. Returning to Sutter's Fort, Reed found himself caught in the surge of California history.
The Mexican War was raging in California, and all able-bodied men had been mustered into service as part of John C. Fremont's California Battalion.
As one of only 1,000 U.S. citizens in California, Reed was quickly placed in charge of Mission San Jose. But by mid-February, he was leading a rescue party towards Truckee Lake, this time over hard-packed snows. McCutcheon, who had arrived at Sutter's Fort with Stanton in October, was with him. A first rescue party was 2.5 weeks ahead of them.
February 19, 1847. Froze hard last night. 7 men arrived from California yesterday evening with some provisions, but left greater part on the way. Patrick Breen.
The first rescuers led 21 of the strongest members of the Donner Party across the mountains, including James Reed's wife and 2 of their 4 children. 18 of that group of 21 would survive. But for those left at the camps, the situation grew even more desperate.
February 26, 1847. Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she would commence on Milt and eat him. I don't know that she has done so yet. It is distressing. Patrick Breen.
On his way to the lake, Reed met his wife and 2 children heading for Johnson's ranch.
Mother knelt on the snow while I tried to run to reach Papa. When my father learned that 2 of his children were still at the cabins, he hurried on, so fearful was he that they might perish before he reached them. Virginia Reed.
When he got there, what he found at the meadows was that cannibalism had been rife. He found that people had eventually been reduced to eating their own dead. Jacob Donner's body had been cut open, and what they found were 2 boys sitting on a log, their clothes blood splattered from having eaten what was in front of them. And the only thing they could have eaten would have been their father's heart and liver.
The members of the party tried to make use of any nutrition from these corpses that they could, and they found that they had so little flesh on them that it provided them with very few calories, and the best nutrition they got out of them were the organ meats.
When I spoke of human flesh being used at both tents, I said it was prepared for the little ones in both tents. Father was crying and did not look at us during the time, and we little ones felt that we could not help it. There was nothing else. Georgia Donner Babcock, 4 years old during the entrapment.
Reed found his daughter Patty and his 3-year-old son Thomas alive in the Breen cabin. There he found no signs of cannibalism. But in the Murphy cabin, he found Mrs. Murphy insane and mutilated corpses on the floor. Louis Keysburg, who had called for Reed's lynching on the Humboldt, was lying in filth.
Reed had no animosity towards me. He found me too weak to move. He washed me, combed my hair, and treated me kindly. When he left me, he promised to return in 2 weeks and carry me over the mountains. Louis Keysburg.
Reed quickly started out with 17 of the starving group for a journey over the pass. Patty Reed hid her tiny doll under her clothes, despite instructions to carry nothing unnecessary to survival. Patrick Breen carried his violin.
The first 2 nights were fine. They were climbing the pass. The first night, Patrick Breen played the violin around the campfire. Second night, at the top of the pass, Patrick Breen played the violin again. But on the third night, they were about 3 miles west of the pass when a 3-day storm broke out.
March 6th and 7th, 1847. My dreaded storm is now on us. A great crying with the children, and with the parents praying. Crying and lamentations on account of the cold and the dread of death from the howling storm. The men up nearly all night making fires. Some of the men began to pray. Several became blind. James Reed.
There, they endured a 3-day blizzard, simply huddling around this fire. And this campfire tended to melt the snow and sink deeper and deeper until finally the campfire was resting on the bare earth some 24 feet below the surface of the surrounding snow.
When the storm ended, James Reed and the 3 other rescuers crawled out of the snow pit with Reed's own 2 children and another child. They left the others, including 7 members of the Breen family, to wait for the 3rd team of rescuers. Here at Starved Camp, those who remained would endure the greatest trials of their entrapment. The Breens and other members of the Donner Party, stranded in that snow pit called Starved Camp, prayed that rescuers would bring them food that James Reed had stored a few miles away. But wild animals had eaten the hidden food, and the 3rd rescue party would not appear for an entire week.
Margaret Breen turned out to be the strongest of the lot. Patrick Breen had finally despaired of being rescued. And Margaret Breen led the people in prayer in that pit.
When everyone else was too weak, she was the only one with enough strength to climb the snow steps out of the pit and gather firewood to keep the fire going.
Patrick Breen's wife, Margaret, known as Peggy, had hidden a small sack of sugar and a tiny bit of tea on her person, but it was not enough to sustain 14 starving people for the better part of a week. Mary Graves and one of her children died. Little Isaac Donner had died during the storm.
They were into the pit about 3 days when the awful question, came up: what are we to do? Are the children to starve to death, or do we eat the dead? So Patrick Breen finally climbed out of the pit with a knife and began to carve up the bodies of the dead.
For the first time during their terrible entrapment, the Breens ate human flesh. William Eddy, a survivor of the Forlorn Hope, was in the 3rd rescue party that found the Breens and the others at Starved Camp. Eddy knew that his wife and infant daughter had died at Truckee Lake, but he believed that his small son might still be alive. He hurried onto the lake while a rescuer named John Stark attended to those at Starved Camp.
John Stark was a mountain of a man, 6'6", 240 pounds, said to have twice the strength of any ordinary human being. Well, he demonstrated that by strapping 2 children on his back, plus loads and loads of supplies, and leading Patrick and Peggy Breen and all their children, and a couple other children as well, out of Starved Camp and back to safety.
The ground was covered with fine green grass, and there was a very fat beef hanging from the limb of an oak tree. The journey was over. I kept looking on the scene and could scarcely believe that I was alive. The scene that I saw that morning seems to be photographed on my mind. Most of the incidents are gone from memory through lapse of years, but I can always see the camp near Johnson's Ranch. John Breen, 15 years old during the entrapment.
All 9 members of Patrick Breen's family had survived the harrowing ordeal. All 6 of the Reeds had survived as well. They were the only 2 families to emerge from the mountains intact. For others, the suffering had not ended. William Eddy with the 3rd Rescue Party arrived at Truckee Lake to find that his remaining son had died and been cannibalized. He resisted the urge to kill Keseberg, who had apparently eaten the boy's flesh and left the pitiful German immigrant to fate. Eddy's 3rd relief party left the lake with 5 starving souls, 4 of them children. They would all survive. An additional 5 weak and dying pioneers stayed at the lake, but a next rescue party wouldn't appear until mid-April.
For nearly 2 months, I was alone. 5 of my companions had died in my cabin, and their stark and ghastly bodies lay there day and night, seemingly gazing at me with their glazed and staring eyes. Many a time, I had the muzzle of my pistol in my mouth and my fingers on the trigger. But the faces of my helpless, dependent wife and child would rise up before me, and my hand would fall powerless. Louis Keseberg.
The rescuers reported human bones and body parts scattered about Keseberg's cabin. This last survivor would become the fiend and boogeyman of the Donner Party for a nation anxious for sensational news of the tragedy.
Some members of these relief parties were well paid for their stories, and they understood then, as now, the more bizarre, outrageous, perhaps lurid tends to sell. And Louis Keseberg seems to have been very unfairly slandered.
It has been told that I boasted of my shame, said that I enjoyed this horrid food, and that I remarked that human flesh was more palatable than California beef. This is a falsehood. It is a horrible, revolting falsehood. Louis Keseberg.
With the rescue of Keseberg, a final accounting of the Donner Party would be performed. Of the 79 to be trapped at the lake and Alder Creek camps, 3/4 of the women survived, 2/3 of the children survived, but only 1/3 of the men survived, including a mere 2 of 15 bachelors. A total of 35 died at the lake or shortly thereafter. With varying degrees of success, the survivors re-entered a world of order and accepted boundaries of behavior. Most of them prospered. Some, like the Breens, became very wealthy and a California available for the taking. And some, like Patty Reed, lived to robust old age. Many of the members of the most famous wagon trained across the western mountains would grapple with their singular experience of entrapment for the rest of their lives.
Parties trekking westward often had great losses of men, women, children, and animals. The Donner Party stood out because of the high proportion of the party lost, but it stood out more for the cannibalism that occurred. There, of course, is nothing more repugnant to Americans than the thought of eating human flesh.
We knew who they were. They were us. The gnawing question about the Donner Party is, what would I have done? That searching question is inescapable.
Less than a year after the entrapment of the Donner Party just east of Truckee Pass, James Marshall would discover gold near Sutter's Fort in the Sierra Nevada's western foothills. Fortune hunters rushed into California by the tens of thousands, scores of them crossing the Sierras through the pass, now named for the tragic Donner Group. Many 49ers found their golden dreams along the same streams the Donner Party members followed in their desperate escapes from cold and starvation.